came in at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Dispatch received a frantic, barely coherent voice reporting an assault on Clearwater Beach. When first responders arrived, they found a scene that would shatter a community's faith and expose secrets that had been buried for years. A man lay bleeding in the sand, clutching himself in agony, his screams echoing across the empty shoreline. Within hours, investigators would discover that this wasn't a random attack. This was the violent climax of a double life that had been carefully hidden behind Sunday sermons and family dinners. The victim, Reverend Michael Hayes, one of Florida's most beloved spiritual leaders, a man thousands turned to for guidance, for hope, for truth. By the time the sun fully rose that morning, his reputation would be in ruins, his marriage destroyed, and his body mutilated in a way that would make headlines across the nation. What could drive a respected man of God into such darkness? What secrets was he hiding behind that warm smile and those inspiring words? And why did a passionate encounter on a moonlit beach end in unthinkable violence? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is a story about three people whose lives became fatally intertwined. First, there's Reverend Michael Hayes, 42 years old, father of three, married for 18 years, senior pastor at Lighthouse Community Church, a congregation of over 2,000 members. To his community, he was everything a spiritual leader should be: compassionate, wise, devoted. But who was Michael Hayes when the cameras weren't rolling, when the congregation went home, when the lights in the sanctuary dimmed? Then there's Sarah Hayes, his wife, a woman who dedicated her life to supporting her husband's ministry, raising their children, organizing church events, always smiling, always faithful, always there. What did she know? What did she suspect during those long nights when Michael came home late, claiming he'd been counseling troubled parishioners? And finally, there's Brenda Wilson, 38 years old, independent, complicated, living life on her own terms in a small coastal town where everybody knows everybody's business. She had her own struggles, her own story, her own reasons for keeping certain things private. How did these three lives collide? What was the nature of the relationship that Michael risked everything to hide? And why did a secret meeting on Clearwater Beach leave one man mutilated and two women's lives forever changed? The answers are more complex, more human, and more tragic than you might expect. To understand what happened that night, we need to go back 3 years. Michael Hayes wasn't born into privilege or power. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Tampa, the youngest of 4 children raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a hospital to keep food on the table. His mother was deeply religious, and she made sure her children attended church every Sunday without fail. Michael found something there that he couldn't find at home or in his struggling neighborhood. He found purpose, he found community, he found a calling. By the time he was 16, he was leading youth groups. By 21, he was enrolled in seminary school. By 28, he'd been ordained and was working as an associate pastor at a mid-sized church in Clearwater. That's where he met Sarah Thompson, a Sunday school teacher with kind eyes and a gentle spirit. Their courtship was traditional, respectful, exactly what everyone expected. They married within a year, and Sarah threw herself into supporting Michael's growing ministry. She organized potlucks, visited shut-ins, ran the church nursery, and eventually homeschooled their 3 children so they could maintain what she called a Christ-centered household. From the outside, they looked like the perfect Christian family. Michael's career flourished. His sermons were dynamic, emotional, filled with personal stories and practical wisdom. He had a gift for making biblical principles feel relevant to modern struggles. When Lighthouse Community Church's senior pastor retired, the board unanimously voted to offer Michael the position. He was only 37 years old, but he'd proven himself capable, dedicated, and beloved by the congregation. Under his leadership, the church grew rapidly, adding a second Sunday service, launching community outreach programs, even starting a podcast that gained a modest but devoted following. Michael became something of a local celebrity, invited to speak at conferences, interviewed by Christian magazines, recognized at restaurants and grocery stores. People trusted him with their darkest secrets, their deepest pain, their most vulnerable moments. But maintaining that image required something Michael hadn't anticipated. It required him to be perfect, or at least to appear perfect, all the time. There was no room for doubt, no space for questions, no allowance for the messy, complicated parts of being human. His marriage, while stable, had grown distant over the years. Sarah was focused on the children and church responsibilities. Their conversations revolved around schedules, budgets, and ministry logistics. The intimacy they'd shared in their early years had faded into polite companionship. Michael felt trapped in a role he'd created but no longer knew how to inhabit authentically. He began staying late at the church, claiming he needed quiet time to prepare sermons or handle administrative work. Sometimes that was true. Other times he'd just sit alone in his office, staring at the wall, feeling the weight of expectations crushing down on him. He started questioning things he'd once believed with certainty. He started noticing the hypocrisy around him, the judgment disguised as righteousness, the way people used faith as a weapon rather than a comfort. But he couldn't voice these doubts, couldn't admit his struggles, couldn't show weakness. He was Reverend Michael Hayes, and Reverend Michael Hayes had all the answers. That's when the distance between who he was and who he pretended to be became unbearable. That's when he started looking for something, anything that felt real. 2 years before that fateful night on the beach, Michael met Brenda Wilson at a community fundraiser for a local homeless shelter. She wasn't part of his congregation. In fact, she wasn't religious at all. She worked as a dental hygienist, lived alone in a modest apartment near the coast, and spent her free time painting and volunteering at an animal rescue. Brenda had lived through her own struggles. A difficult divorce in her early 30s had left her financially strained but emotionally liberated. She'd spent years rebuilding her life, learning to be comfortable in her own skin, refusing to apologize for who she was or what she needed. She and Michael struck up a conversation at the fundraiser that lasted over an hour. It was easy, natural, free from pretense. She didn't treat him like a spiritual authority figure. She treated him like a person. They talked about art, about music, about the ocean, about things that had nothing to do with faith or ministry. For the first time in years, Michael felt like himself, not like a character he was playing. They exchanged phone numbers under the pretense of coordinating future volunteer efforts. The first text was innocent enough. So was the second. By the 10th, the conversation had shifted into something more personal. They started meeting for coffee, always in neighboring towns where Michael was less likely to be recognized. He told her about the pressure he felt, the loneliness, the questions that kept him awake at night. She told him about her journey toward self-acceptance, her refusal to live according to other people's expectations. Their connection deepened in a way that both excited and terrified Michael. He knew he was crossing lines, but he felt more alive than he had in a decade. The affair began 6 months before that morning on Clearwater Beach. Michael had convinced himself he could manage it, could compartmentalize his life into neat sections that never overlapped. But secrets have a way of expanding, of demanding more space, more time, more energy. He started lying more frequently to Sarah. He claimed he was visiting sick parishioners, attending clergy meetings, preparing special sermon series that required extensive research. Sarah, trusting and preoccupied with managing their household and homeschooling their children, rarely questioned his absences. The guilt ate at Michael constantly. He'd built his entire career on moral authority, on teaching others about integrity and faithfulness, and walking the righteous path. Yet here he was, sneaking around, lying to his wife, living in direct contradiction to everything he preached. But when he was with Brenda, the guilt faded into the background. She made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. She accepted his doubts, his questions, his imperfections. She didn't need him to have all the answers or be some idealized version of righteousness. With her, he could just be Michael, not Reverend Hayes. But the strain was showing. Michael started drinking more, just a glass or two of wine at night to help him sleep, but enough that Sarah noticed. His sermons, while still polished, lacked the passion they once had. He went through the motions, delivered the expected messages, but felt like a fraud standing behind that pulpit. Several members of the church leadership had quietly expressed concern about his well-being, asking if everything was all right, if he needed a break, if there was anything they could do to support him. He assured them everything was fine, that he was just tired, that ministry was demanding but rewarding. The lies kept piling up, getting heavier, harder to manage. The night of June 14th started like so many others had over the past 6 months. Michael told Sarah he needed to visit a family in the congregation who was going through a crisis. He didn't specify which family, and Sarah didn't ask. She was used to his irregular schedule, used to being the parent who handled bedtime routines and homework questions alone. Michael drove 40 minutes north to a quiet stretch of beach where he'd arranged to meet Brenda. They'd chosen this location specifically because it was far from Clearwater, far from anyone who might recognize him. Brenda arrived first, parking her car near a public access point and walking down to the sand. The moon was nearly full that night, casting silver light across the water. She'd taken time getting ready, changing outfits 3 times, applying makeup carefully, feeling a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Their relationship had grown increasingly intense over the past few months, and she knew they were reaching a point where decisions would have to be made, where the situation couldn't continue indefinitely in this suspended state of secrecy. When Michael arrived, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes. They walked along the shore, talking in low voices, their words barely audible over the sound of waves breaking on the sand. Michael told her he didn't know how much longer he could maintain this double life. The pressure was suffocating him. He talked about leaving the ministry, about starting over somewhere new, about finding a way to be honest about who he was and what he needed. But even as he said these things, Brenda could hear the fear in his voice. She knew he was terrified of losing his children, his reputation, his entire identity. Everything he'd built over 2 decades would crumble if the truth came out. They found a secluded spot behind a cluster of dunes where the beach grass provided some privacy from the occasional late-night jogger or beach walker. What happened next was a mix of passion and desperation, 2 people clinging to each other while knowing their time together was running out. But Michael's phone kept buzzing in his pocket. Text messages from Sarah asking when he'd be home, reminding him that their daughter had a doctor's appointment early the next morning, telling him she'd left dinner in the oven. Each notification was like a knife twisting in his gut, a reminder of the life he was betraying, the woman who trusted him completely and deserved so much better than his lies. After they'd been together, as they lay on a blanket staring up at the stars, Brenda finally asked the question that had been building for months. "What are we doing, Michael? Where is this going? Can you honestly tell me you're going to leave your wife, your church, your entire life, and build something real with me? Or are we just going to keep meeting in secret until one of us can't take it anymore?" Michael didn't have an answer. He wanted to promise her everything, wanted to believe he had the courage to walk away from his old life and start fresh. But he knew himself well enough to recognize that he was paralyzed by fear, by the weight of expectations, by the certain knowledge that leaving would mean losing his children, his career, his community, everything that defined him. The conversation grew heated. Brenda's frustration boiled over into anger. She told him she couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep being the secret he was ashamed of. She deserved more than stolen moments on dark beaches. She deserved someone who was proud to be with her, who wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder, terrified of being discovered. If you're still with me, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's really following this story closely. Michael felt the panic rising in his chest. He couldn't lose her, but he also couldn't imagine dismantling his entire life. The two realities were incompatible, pulling him in opposite directions, tearing him apart. He reached for Brenda, trying to pull her close, trying to reassure her with physical affection when he couldn't offer the words she needed to hear. But she pulled away from him, frustrated, hurt, done with the endless cycle of intimacy followed by uncertainty. She stood up, brushing sand from her clothes, and told him she needed space to think, that maybe they both did. She started walking back toward the parking area, leaving Michael sitting alone on the blanket, feeling his world crumbling around him. That's when everything changed. Michael's phone rang, not a text this time, but an actual call. He looked at the screen and saw Sarah's name. His heart stopped. It was nearly midnight. She never called this late unless something was wrong. He answered, trying to keep his voice calm, trying to sound like he was exactly where he'd said he'd be, visiting a family in crisis. Sarah's voice on the other end was quiet, measured, chillingly calm. She asked him one simple question. "Where are you really, Michael?" "Not where you said you'd be, because I called the family you supposedly went to visit and they had no idea what I was talking about. So I'll ask you again. Where are you? And who are you with?" Michael's entire body went cold. He stammered, tried to construct a plausible explanation, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was racing, calculating how much she knew, how long she'd been suspicious, what evidence she might have. Before he could form a coherent response, Sarah continued, her voice breaking now, tears evident behind the words. "I found the messages, Michael. I've known for weeks. I kept hoping I was wrong, kept telling myself there had to be another explanation. But I'm not wrong, am I?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of years of deception finally exposed. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Michael would later struggle to piece together the exact sequence of events. He hung up the phone and ran after Brenda, catching up to her near the parking area. He was frantic, desperate, telling her that Sarah knew everything, that his marriage was over, that his entire life was imploding in real time. Brenda, despite her own hurt and frustration, felt a wave of sympathy for him. She could see he was on the verge of a complete breakdown. They stood in the parking lot talking for nearly an hour, trying to figure out what to do next. Michael knew he had to go home, had to face Sarah, had to deal with the consequences of his choices, but he was terrified, paralyzed by the magnitude of what he was about to lose. Brenda held his hand, trying to ground him, trying to help him focus. She told him to go home, to be honest, to handle this with whatever dignity he could salvage. She promised they'd talk tomorrow, that they'd figure things out together, that he wouldn't have to face this alone. Around 1:30 in the morning, Michael finally got in his car and started the drive back to Clearwater. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. His mind was spinning through scenarios, imagining the conversation with Sarah, picturing his children's faces when they found out their father had been lying to them for months. He thought about the church leadership, about the congregation, about the inevitable scandal that would erupt. He thought about losing his job, his reputation, his place in the community. But Michael never made it home that night. Somewhere along the dark highway between the beach and Clearwater, he pulled over to the side of the road. Witnesses later reported seeing a man sitting in his car on the shoulder, his head in his hands, for over an hour. At some point, he made a decision that would change everything. He turned the car around and drove back to the beach. He needed to see Brenda one more time before he faced the destruction of his old life. He needed to feel grounded, to be reminded that there was something real waiting for him on the other side of this catastrophe. When he arrived back at the beach, Brenda's car was still in the parking lot. He found her sitting on the hood, staring out at the ocean. She was surprised to see him, concerned about why he'd come back instead of going home to deal with his wife. They walked back down to the sand, and Michael told her he loved her, that he was going to leave Sarah, that they could finally be together openly. But even as he said these words, Brenda could hear the desperation in them, could sense that he was making promises in a moment of panic rather than from a place of genuine decision. She asked him to slow down, to think clearly, to not make huge life choices while he was in the middle of an emotional crisis. That's when the argument started. Michael insisted that this was what he wanted, that he'd been living a lie for years, that being with her was the only honest thing in his life. Brenda pushed back, telling him that running to her because his secret had been exposed wasn't the same as choosing her, that she didn't want to be his escape plan or his rebound. She needed him to be certain, and right now, all she saw was a man in freefall, grasping at anything to break his descent. The argument escalated, voices rising, emotions spilling over. At one point, Michael grabbed Brenda's shoulders, not violently, but firmly, trying to make her understand the intensity of what he was feeling. She pulled away sharply, telling him not to touch her when he was in this state, telling him he needed to go home and sort out his life before they could have any meaningful conversation about their future. Michael felt something snap inside him. All the pressure, all the fear, all the guilt that had been building for months reached a breaking point. He shouted at her, accused her of leading him on, of being the reason his life was falling apart. Brenda, her own anger flaring now, shouted back that he was the one who'd made the choice to lie, to cheat, to build a life on false pretenses. She told him to take responsibility for his own decisions and stop blaming her for the consequences of his actions. The fight went on for several more minutes, both of them saying things they didn't mean, weaponizing each other's vulnerabilities, striking out from pain and fear. Finally, exhausted and emotionally drained, Brenda told Michael she was leaving, that he needed to figure out his life, and that she couldn't do this anymore. She turned and started walking toward the parking lot. Michael stood there in the sand, watching her go, feeling everything slipping through his fingers, his marriage, his ministry, and now the one relationship that had felt genuine was walking away. In that moment of desperation and rage and utter loss of control, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He picked up a rock from the sand and threw it toward Brenda, not intending to hit her, just a gesture of frustrated rage, like a child having a tantrum. But his aim was poor, his judgment impaired by emotion and exhaustion. The rock struck Brenda in the back of the head. She stumbled forward, disoriented, confused about what had just happened. Michael ran to her, horrified by what he'd done, trying to apologize, trying to help her. But Brenda, now terrified and injured, pushed him away and ran toward her car. Michael chased after her, panic overriding rational thought. What happened next in the parking lot would be pieced together later from security footage from a nearby business and from the physical evidence at the scene. There was a physical altercation, a struggle, both of them operating from fear and adrenaline rather than clear thinking. At some point during this confrontation, Brenda grabbed something from her car. It was a tool she kept for self-defense. A small blade she carried after her divorce left her feeling vulnerable. In the chaos of the moment, fearing for her safety, she used it. The injury she inflicted was devastating and irreversible. Michael collapsed on the ground, screaming in agony. Brenda, realizing what she'd done, stood frozen for several seconds before her survival instincts kicked in. She got in her car and drove away, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control the vehicle. She drove for 20 minutes before pulling over to the side of the road and throwing up. She sat there for another hour, trying to process what had just happened, trying to figure out what to do next. Meanwhile, back at the beach, Michael managed to call for help. Emergency services arrived within 15 minutes, finding him bleeding profusely, barely conscious from pain and blood loss. The paramedics worked quickly to stabilize him before transporting him to the nearest hospital. The physical damage was severe and permanent. Surgeons did what they could, but some injuries can't be repaired. By the time Michael was out of surgery and stable enough to talk to investigators, news of the incident had already begun to spread through the community. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Detectives began by interviewing Michael, who was initially reluctant to provide details about what had happened or who had been involved. He claimed it was a random attack, that he'd been walking on the beach alone and someone had assaulted him. But his story had too many inconsistencies, and investigators quickly determined he wasn't being truthful. They pulled phone records and discovered the frequent communication between Michael and Brenda. They interviewed Sarah, who reluctantly confirmed her suspicions about the affair and the confrontation she'd had with her husband that night. They tracked down Brenda, who had driven home and sat in her apartment for hours before finally turning herself in to the police. In her statement to detectives, Brenda described the entire evening in detail. She explained the nature of her relationship with Michael, the argument they'd had, the rock he'd thrown, the fear she'd felt when he chased her to the parking lot. She insisted that she'd acted in self-defense, that she believed he was going to hurt her, that she never intended to cause the specific injury she inflicted. The district attorney's office faced a complicated decision about whether to press charges and what those charges should be. Was this self-defense? Was it excessive force? Was it a crime of passion? The physical evidence supported Brenda's account of the evening's events, including security footage that showed Michael chasing her in the parking lot. Her attorney argued that she was a woman alone, confronted by a man in an unstable emotional state who had already thrown a rock at her and injured her. She had reason to fear for her safety and acted to protect herself. But public opinion was divided. Some members of the community viewed Michael as the victim, a respected leader whose life had been destroyed by a moment of passion and poor judgment. They pointed to his years of service, his contributions to the community, his family who would now suffer the consequences of this tragedy. Others saw Brenda as the victim, a woman who'd been involved with a man who lied to her about his intentions and then became violent when confronted with the consequences of his choices. The church community was shattered. Members of Lighthouse Community Church struggled to reconcile the image of their beloved pastor with the reality of his secret life. Some stood by him, arguing that everyone makes mistakes and that true Christianity is about forgiveness and redemption. Others felt deeply betrayed, angry that someone they'd trusted with their deepest struggles had been living a lie the entire time. The church board held emergency meetings to discuss Michael's future with the congregation. Within a week, they'd made their decision. Michael was asked to resign his position immediately. His access to the church building was revoked. His photo was removed from the website and church literature. 20 years of ministry were erased almost overnight. Sarah filed for divorce within 2 weeks of the incident. She released a brief statement through her attorney expressing her heartbreak and asking for privacy for herself and her children during this difficult time. She moved with the kids to live with her parents in another state, cutting all ties with Clearwater and the life she'd built there. The children, ages 16, 13, and 9, were pulled from their homeschool co-op and enrolled in public school under their mother's maiden name, trying to escape the shadow of their father's scandal. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. Brenda was initially charged with aggravated battery, but after extensive negotiation between prosecutors and her defense team, the charges were reduced. She ultimately pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and received a sentence of probation, mandatory counseling, and community service. The judge acknowledged that while her actions had caused permanent harm, the circumstances suggested she'd been acting out of genuine fear for her safety. Michael's physical recovery took months, but the emotional and psychological damage would never fully heal. He lost his career, his family, his reputation, his place in the community, and his physical wholeness all in the span of one catastrophic night. He moved away from Florida, trying to start over in a place where nobody knew his story, but the internet has a long memory, and the scandal had been covered extensively in both local and Christian media. Whenever he applied for jobs, the background checks inevitably turned up the news articles. He struggled with depression and substance abuse in the years that followed. The guilt of what he'd lost, what he'd put his family through, what he'd done to Brenda, consumed him. Several years after the incident, Michael gave one interview to a religious podcast focused on stories of redemption and restoration. In it, he spoke carefully about his mistakes, his pride, his failure to be honest with himself and others about his struggles. He talked about the crushing weight of maintaining a perfect image, about the isolation of being put on a pedestal, about the human need for authenticity and connection. But he never fully took responsibility for the violence of that night, always framing himself as someone who'd made mistakes, but had been punished far beyond what was warranted. Brenda also struggled in the aftermath of the incident. While she avoided prison, she couldn't escape the judgment of those who knew her story. Some viewed her as a homewrecker, a temptress who'd destroyed a family. Others saw her as a victim of a manipulative man who'd lied about his situation and then attacked her when his lies were exposed. The truth, as it often is, was more complicated than either extreme narrative. She underwent extensive therapy to process the trauma of that night and the moral complexity of having permanently injured someone, even in self-defense. She eventually moved to a different state as well, seeking a fresh start away from the memories and the whispers and the constant reminder of the worst night of her life. Years later, in her own interview for a podcast about women who'd experienced violence, she spoke about the impossibility of the situation she'd found herself in. She talked about falling for someone who presented himself as available emotionally, if not legally, about the gradual realization that she was being used as an escape rather than chosen as a partner. She talked about the fear she felt that night, the split-second decision to defend herself, and the guilt that haunted her knowing that her actions, while legally justified, had forever altered another human being's life. She emphasized that she never wanted what happened, that she wished she could go back and make different choices, that she carried the weight of that night every single day. The most tragic victims of this entire situation were arguably Michael's children, who lost their father, their home, their community, and their sense of stability all at once. They had to navigate adolescence and young adulthood while carrying the shame and confusion of their father's public fall from grace. The oldest, a daughter who'd been heavily involved in the church's youth ministry and had planned to attend a Christian college, abandoned her faith entirely. She struggled with trust issues and anxiety, having watched her entire worldview crumble in the span of a few weeks. The story of what happened on that beach doesn't have a neat, satisfying ending, because real life rarely does. 5 years after the incident, each person involved was still living with the consequences of that night. Michael was working a low-wage job in a small town in Georgia, living alone in a one-bedroom apartment, estranged from his children who wanted nothing to do with him. He attended a small, anonymous church where nobody knew his history, sitting in the back row, never participating, just listening. He'd given up on ministry, on leadership, on any kind of public life. The man who once stood confidently before thousands was now invisible, damaged, carrying shame that had become part of his identity. Sarah had rebuilt her life with remarkable resilience. She completed a nursing degree and was working at a hospital in North Carolina. She'd started dating someone new, a kind man who had no connection to church life and who treated her with the respect and honesty she deserved. Her children were adjusting, slowly, to their new normal. The oldest daughter was in therapy and making progress in processing her trauma and anger. The younger children were doing better, having been somewhat protected from the full weight of the scandal by their age. Sarah rarely talked about Michael anymore. When asked about that period of her life, she'd simply say it was a dark time that she'd survived, and she was focused on moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. Brenda had also found a measure of peace, though it came with effort and intention. She'd moved to Oregon, about as far from Florida as she could get while staying on the mainland. She worked as a hygienist at a dental practice that specialized in treating patients with severe anxiety, finding purpose in helping people who were afraid and vulnerable. She'd started painting again, creating vivid seascapes that she sold at local art fairs. She'd been in a stable relationship for 2 years with someone who knew her full story and accepted her completely, someone who understood that people are more than their worst moments. She still had nightmares sometimes, still carried guilt about what happened, but she'd learned to forgive herself, to recognize that she'd been in an impossible situation and had done what she felt necessary to survive. The church community that Michael left behind struggled for years to recover from the scandal. Attendance dropped by nearly 40% in the first year after his resignation. Many families left to join other congregations, unable to worship in a place that reminded them of the betrayal. The church brought in professional counselors to help members process their feelings of anger, confusion, and broken trust. They implemented new policies around pastoral accountability, requiring senior leaders to have more oversight and support systems to prevent the kind of isolation that had contributed to Michael's hidden struggles. Slowly, painfully, the congregation began to heal. They called a new pastor, a woman with a background in trauma-informed ministry, who helped them rebuild on a foundation of authenticity rather than perfection. She preached openly about her own struggles, her own doubts, her own imperfections, modeling a different kind of spiritual leadership that acknowledged the full humanity of both clergy and congregation. The broader Christian community had its own reckoning with this story, and others like it. Michael's fall was part of a larger pattern that was being exposed across the country. Stories of respected leaders living double lives, of the impossible standards placed on clergy, of the toxic culture of perfectionism that prevented people from seeking help when they were struggling. Some churches began implementing healthier support systems for their pastors, recognizing that spiritual leaders are human beings who need care, accountability, and space to be vulnerable without fear of judgment or rejection. Other churches doubled down on purity culture and moral perfectionism, using stories like Michael's as cautionary tales about the dangers of straying from righteousness, missing entirely the point that it was the pressure to appear perfect that contributed to the tragedy in the first place. Looking at this story from a distance, it's tempting to assign clear roles, to decide who was the villain and who was the victim, to find a simple moral lesson that ties everything up neatly. But real life is messier than that. Michael was both a victimizer and a victim, a man who hurt the people he claimed to love, but who was also crushed by impossible expectations and his own inability to be honest about who he was. Brenda was both a participant in an affair that damaged a family and a woman who was deceived about the nature of her relationship and then violently attacked when things fell apart. Sarah was both a devoted wife who supported her husband's ministry and someone who perhaps turned a blind eye to warning signs because acknowledging them would have shattered her carefully constructed life. The question that haunts this story isn't who was right or who was wrong. The question is how we create communities where people can be honest about their struggles before those struggles explode into tragedy. How do we balance accountability with compassion? How do we hold space for human imperfection without excusing harmful behavior? Michael's story reveals the danger of pedestals, of the impossible standards we place on religious leaders that prevent them from acknowledging doubt, struggle, or need. It shows what happens when people feel they must hide essential parts of themselves to maintain their place in a community. It demonstrates how secrets grow in the dark, feeding on shame and fear until they become monstrous. If Michael had felt safe admitting years earlier that his marriage was struggling, that he had doubts about his faith, that the pressure of ministry was overwhelming him, could the tragedy have been prevented? If church culture allowed for leaders to be vulnerable, to seek help, to step back when they're overwhelmed, would Michael have found a healthier path forward? If Sarah had felt empowered to confront problems in her marriage rather than maintaining the appearance of perfection, could they have addressed their issues before they led to betrayal? These are uncomfortable questions because they force us to examine the systems and cultures we've created, the ways we contribute to environments where people feel they must choose between authenticity and belonging. By the time the sun rose over Florida's coast that June morning 5 years ago, Michael Hayes' secret life wasn't just exposed, it was destroyed, and so were the lives connected to his. 3 people walked away from that beach forever changed, carrying scars both visible and invisible, living with consequences that rippled outward, touching children, congregations, families, and communities. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the people we trust most, about the pressure we place on leaders to be more than human, about the culture of secrecy that allows problems to fester until they explode. It asks us to consider what we would do in Sarah's position, discovering that the person you've built your entire life around has been lying to you for months. How would you move forward? Could you forgive? Would you want to? It challenges us to think about Michael's situation, trapped between the person he was expected to be and the person he actually was, unable to find a way to bridge that gap without losing everything. Have you ever felt the pressure to maintain an image that didn't match your reality? Have you ever hidden parts of yourself because you feared judgment or rejection? And what about Brenda, who found herself in a relationship that seemed genuine but was built on deception, who then had to make a split-second decision to protect herself that would alter someone's life permanently? Could you live with that? How would you process that kind of guilt, even knowing you acted in self-defense? The truth is that most of us will never face a situation as extreme as what happened on that beach that June night. But all of us will face moments where we have to choose between honesty and image, between vulnerability and self-protection, between what's expected and what's authentic. We all live in communities that have spoken and unspoken rules about what's acceptable, what can be discussed, what must be hidden. And those rules, however well-intentioned, can create pressure that distorts people, that forces them into corners where desperate choices seem like the only option. This story isn't just about a pastor who had an affair, or a woman who defended herself, or a wife who was betrayed. It's about what happens when human beings are placed in systems that don't allow room for their full humanity, when the gap between expectation and reality becomes so wide that people feel they must choose between their authentic selves and their place in the community they belong to. It's about the price we all pay when we prioritize appearance over truth, when we demand perfection instead of growth, when we judge rather than support.